What if the most colossal fraud in the galaxy wasn't concocted by beings from beyond the stars, but by the very hands of humanity? The truth, you see, is a chilling testament far darker than any empire would ever dare whisper. Our homeworld, Earth, wasn't brought to its knees by invading forces. No unknown power from the cosmic dark annihilated our cradle. Earth wasn't a mere casualty of an indifferent universe. It was a self-inflicted wound, gouged deep by its own kind, by their boundless greed, their insatiable lust for dominance, and the blinding arrogance of a species convinced it could gorge itself on creation without ever paying the piper. Yet the true horror wasn't the planet's demise itself. It was the chilling aftermath. As the world crumbled to toxic dust, oceans boiled, the firmament became a festering scar, and terrestrial civilization gasped its last. The survivors didn't choose contrition. They didn't embrace the stark, bitter truth. Instead, they spun a convenient yarn, a sanitized version of history palatable enough to swallow. They purged archives, doctored records, and meticulously rewrote the collective memory of billions, transforming the true architects of ruin into revered martyrs. Humanity began to parrot this new narrative to itself and to every new world it encountered, that Earth had been lost to malevolent, brutal extraterrestrial forces, that hostile alien powers had driven their planet to ruination. That humans weren't the perpetrators of their own apocalypse, but rather the valiant survivors of a cosmic atrocity inflicted by others. Thus was born the galaxy's most insidious lie, a fabrication so potent it didn't merely shroud the past. It became the very cornerstone upon which their future would be built. For a civilization convinced it suffered a cosmic injustice believes any atrocity is righteous self-defense. Every massacre, a preemptive strike, every invasion, a desperate act of survival. And so the die was cast. From Earth's ashes, something far more sinister than a desperate people emerged. An empire, cold as the void, calculating as a predator, ravenous as a black hole, an empire that emblazoned its banners with tales of suffering, yet clutched the instruments of conquest in its iron grip. Humanity surged across the cosmos, not as weary refugees, but as relentless predators. Every newly charted star system, a target, every verdant world, a raw resource. Every unknown species, a potential threat, and every potential threat met the same grim choice, subjugation or oblivion. In their fervent oath to never again be victims, humans became the very monsters they claimed to avenge. Fleets materialized on the galactic fringes, colossal vessels forged from stolen schematics, powered by technologies ripped from the grasp of non-human hands. Ancient peoples were hunted to extinction, their laboratories ransacked, cosmic temples reduced to rubble, all to fuel the inexorable expansion of an empire built on the bedrock of deceit, terror, and spilled blood. With every conquest, their self-deception deepened. In war academies, children were fed tales of Earth's sacrifice at the hands of malevolent alien races. In command centers, generals proclaimed dominion over the stars as their inherent right. On occupied worlds, the human presence was heralded as liberation. But there was no liberation, only more sophisticated shackles, only slavery draped in a new guise, only destruction on a cosmic scale. Entire species were crushed into servitude, planets bled dry until they were desolate husks, atmospheres choked, alien seas poisoned, moons disassembled to feed ravenous war yards. Yet at the Empire's beating heart, the propaganda machine churned relentlessly. Humanity didn't see itself as an invader. It saw itself as the rightful heir to the cosmos, the chosen species destined to shepherd the stars, the sole bringer of order to the wild void. Perhaps that's the most unsettling truth of all. Humanity didn't just obliterate Earth, it obliterated the very concept of truth. For once the lie became official doctrine. Horror ceased to be horror. It transmuted into policy, into strategy, into an inescapable destiny. The empire swelled with alarming speed, system after system, world after world, leaving in its wake the familiar tapestry of ruins, silence, and enforced obedience. In the early days, some dared to resist. Ancient species forged desperate pacts, attempting to stem the human tide. But how do you fight an adversary that weaponizes its own guilt? How do you face a civilization utterly convinced that every act of violence is righteous retribution? This was the galaxy's true blight. Humans didn't merely seek survival, they craved retribution for their self-inflicted downfall, seeking to dominate everything beyond their blighted home. As if conquering the cosmos could somehow absolve the original sin of Earth. As if seizing the heavens could wash away the stain of the world they'd personally dismantled. But the cosmos has a cruel, elegant way of answering such hubris. For every lie, no matter how monumental, eventually collides with something utterly beyond its control, something that defies manipulation, something that cannot be expunged from the annals of time, something immune to propaganda, banners, or empty justifications. And when that moment arrives, even the mightiest empires begin to tremble. For there's a vast chasm between subjugating defenseless worlds and rousing forces that slumbered long before the first human ever cast their gaze upon the stars. The lie had, in its own twisted way, saved humanity from immediate implosion. It forged a new narrative, a fresh banner, a convenient enemy. But in doing so, it signed the death warrant of the entire galaxy. For that very lie paved the way for centuries of brutal war. It transformed desperate survivors into merciless conquerors. It sculpted humanity into the very nightmare of countless star systems, and the most chilling irony, they still clung to the conviction of their own righteousness, but mere galactic conquest was never enough for humanity. Empires fueled by insatiable ambition don't cease upon victory. They halt only when confronted by something utterly beyond their grasp, or when shattered in their relentless pursuit of dominion over the sacred and forbidden. And so, this relentless drive led the human fleet to one of the cosmos's most whispered-about terrors, Mors Eternum, a name that struck dread even into the hearts of the coldest admirals, a forbidden zone, a cosmic mausoleum, a chasm where light entered, but hope never returned. Centuries of relentless expansion, ruthless plunder, and unending conflict had instilled in the human empire a dangerous certainty. Their conquest knew no true bounds. They had swept through entire star systems, bent ancient species to their will, and plundered technologies so impossibly old they bordered on magic. Yet it was never enough. The Empire's true hunger wasn't merely to govern planets, it was to dictate the very destiny of the universe itself. And for that, they needed something definitive, an ultimate weapon, a relic of such unfathomable power that no race, no fleet, no mechanical god of the stars could ever stand against them again. Then, faint whispers began to stir in the High Command's most forbidden archives. Scraps of star charts, incomplete transmissions, coordinates buried deep within databases wiped clean millennia ago, all converged on one name, Mors Eternum. At the heart of that forsaken region, shrouded by impossible spatial distortions and orbital ruins, utterly alien to any known civilization, something lay dormant. Something that had outlived the fall of empires older than time itself. A power so immense it had been hidden from the galaxy, as if the very fabric of the cosmos had conspired to entomb it. And, true to form, when humanity scented power, it marched. The campaign for Mors Eternum unfurled like every grand imperial offensive, with stirring speeches, grand promises of security, and the ancient, threadbare lie that it was all for the protection of mankind. In command centers, strategists spoke of securing peace. On military channels, propaganda glorified the mission as an inevitable stride towards humanity's final apotheosis. But the truth was a bitter pill. This was no defensive maneuver. This was a stellar-scale smash and grab. The fleet dispatched to Mors Eternum was no mere military division. It was a juggernaut of war. Heavy cruisers, gravitational dreadnoughts, orbital interceptors, lab ships, and containment platforms streamed through the void in an unbreakable formation, as if space itself had been rent open by an incoming storm of steel. From the command decks, officers surveyed the advance with the same unyielding arrogance that had once doomed Earth. To them, it mattered not what lay hidden within that cursed place. If it was a weapon, it would be seized. If it was an entity, it would be shackled. If it was a relic, it would be reforged into an instrument of war. This had always been humanity's fatal gift, to gaze upon the unknown and declare it is ours. But Mors Eternum was no common territory. No frontier to be breached, no defenseless world awaiting the conqueror's boot. It was a gaping wound in the very fabric of the cosmos. The closer the fleet drew, the more space itself seemed to twist around them. Sensors shrieked into madness. Navigation routes vanished from real-time charts. The silence between transmissions grew impossibly heavy, as if the void itself was holding its breath, observing every move of these encroaching invaders. And then, for the first time, even the most battle-hardened veterans felt the cold prickle of fear. Adorning the periphery of Mors Eternum were the skeletal remains of bygone civilizations. Gargantuan fragments of unknown structures drifted slowly around the black hole's maw, like the shattered remnants of a war forgotten by millennia. Broken spires, colossal metallic rings, temples of impossible geometry, and the husks of starcraft that bore no resemblance to anything crafted by human or known alien hands. Everything about the place felt profoundly wrong, too ancient, too silent, too eerily preserved. As if these ruins weren't merely destroyed, but abandoned in frantic haste by something far more terrifying than simple demise. The region's treacherous gravitational fields turned every maneuver into a death-defying gamble. Ships were snatched from their course without warning. Hulls groaned and twisted under unseen pressures. There were entire sectors where time itself seemed to stutter, leaving crews to swear they'd witnessed phantom movements, echoes of themselves, or fleeting shadows flitting through the metal corridors. Yet, despite these unsettling phenomena, the fleet pressed on. For the human empire, the scent of ultimate power transformed fear from a hindrance into a potent fuel. With every kilometer gained, the High Command's conviction solidified. This region wasn't empty by chance. These ruins weren't here without purpose. Something profound lay buried at Mors Eternum's heart. Something other civilizations had either desperately tried to shield or utterly eradicate. And in the Empire's cold calculus, anything so ferociously guarded must surely be worth any sacrifice. Thus, the campaign morphed from a mere military operation into a full-blown obsession. Scientists toiled ceaselessly, striving to decipher ancient inscriptions gleaned from the ruins. Intelligence officers pieced together legends, purloined data, and fragmented records of extinct peoples. Slowly, a terrifying possibility began to coalesce. What if, at the core of that abyss, lay a relic capable of tearing apart the very fabric of galactic balance? A weapon that could not merely shatter fleets, but bend space, time, and gravity to its wielder's whim. A power that would render the human empire utterly absolute. The idea spread like wildfire through the upper echelons. Some envisioned the key to a golden age. Others saw the chance to forge humanity into an eternal, invincible force. There were even those who believed Mors Eternum held the answer to humanity's deepest, darkest secret fear. proof that powers still existed in the universe before which their empire was but dust. And so the fateful order was issued: advance, explore, seize, no matter the cost. The first units were deployed into the outer reaches of the ruins. Reconnaissance teams vanished almost instantly. Signals died. Cameras transmitted back distorted images, inexplicable blurs, entire corridors warping and breathing as if alive. Yet the commanders pressed on. More troops were committed, more ships sacrificed, more lives hurled into a place that seemed to actively recoil from their presence. For humanity, acknowledging limits had always been a far greater agony than simply smashing through them. And it was in this blind, arrogant, irreversible march that the Empire made the catastrophic error that would reshape everything. Unbeknownst to them, they weren't merely drawing near a weapon, nor a relic, nor a forgotten secret. They were hurtling towards a judgment. For deep within Mors Eternum, at the very heart of that stellar tomb, surrounded by shattered ruins and fractured gravity, lay something that had not been hidden to be discovered. It had been sealed away, never to awaken. And humanity, in its infinite hubris, once again mistook a dire warning for an open invitation. Yet humanity's greatest transgression was never just destruction. It was the unwavering conviction that everything buried within the universe existed solely to be unearthed, mastered, and weaponized. For some things are not merely ruins, they are stark warnings. And at the ravaged core of Mors Eternum, amidst collapsing gravitational fields, the derelict husks of forgotten civilizations, and a silence profound enough to drive an entire crew to madness, there stood a warning greater than all others. A sarcophagus, not a common tomb, not a containment pod, not a technological vault forged by human hands. This was something far more primordial, far more imposing, far more unsettling. Suspended in the void, as if in defiance of gravity itself, the cosmic sarcophagus remained utterly pristine at the core of a colossal, ruined structure. It did not orbit like the surrounding debris. It did not spin. It did not hum. It emitted no discernible heat. It simply was, existing outside all known logic, utterly immobile within the heart of an abyss where all else was dragged, shattered or warped by the black hole's silent, unseen hunger. And yet, there it stood, waiting. When the first images flickered onto the command ship's screens, even the most seasoned officers fell into a stunned silence. The sarcophagus's surface appeared wrought from an impossible metal, dark as the void between galaxies, yet etched with slow, pulsing lines that glowed faintly, as if something ancient and terrible still drew breath within. Unknown symbols, inscribed with a precision no human tool could ever hope to replicate, traversed its entire form. It didn't look constructed. It looked sealed. Science teams were summoned with immediate urgency. Scans commenced. Energy readings spiked, threatening to overload the panels. Sensors registered impossible levels of density, incomprehensible containment fields, and a gravitational signature that defied all known physics. It was as if this single object contained within itself a force potent enough to warp the very space-time around it, and this precisely was what ignited the Empire's ultimate obsession. For humanity, the unknown harbored only two fates: to be tamed and exploited, or to be obliterated before it could slip from their grasp. In the hushed corridors of the flagship, officers debated feverishly about its contents. Some theorized an ancestral weapon, others posited a long-lost biotechnological intelligence. There were those who suggested the object was the very power source that had sustained ancient civilizations for eons. And naturally, the most ambitious among them already dreamed of something far grander. If this could be opened, if it could be controlled, then perhaps humanity had finally stumbled upon the ultimate power. The power to crush any burgeoning resistance, the power to solidify their dominion over the cosmos, the power to stand utterly fearless against anything the universe might throw at them. And so, the fateful command was issued. Breach authorized. Elite breach teams were deployed into the central structure. Grav-armored soldiers pushed through shattered corridors, ravaged chambers, and passages choked with ancient symbols. With every step, the environment seemed to recoil from their presence. Dead lights flared for a fleeting second before dying again. Walls echoed with sounds that had no discernible source. At times, team members swore they heard phantom voices cutting across their comms, despite all channels being secure. Yet the mission pressed on, for humanity's arrogance had always outweighed its instinct for self-preservation. Upon reaching the main chamber, the soldiers found the sarcophagus suspended over a circular abyss, ringed by broken columns and the petrified wreckage of ancient machinery. The place resembled a temple, not for worship, but for absolute confinement, as if an entire civilization had poured all its might into ensuring this thing would never again see the light of day. Still, humanity surged forward. Drilling mechanisms engaged, external containment fields shimmered into existence. Mechanical arms with an almost sacrilegious touch made contact with the sarcophagus's surface for the first time in countless epochs. And then, the cosmos itself seemed to answer. The chamber lights erupted in a searing cascade, sensors flatlined, gravity itself bucked and shifted for agonizing seconds. Men were hurled against ceilings, slammed into walls, thrown into one another. Alarms screamed across the entire fleet simultaneously. On the command ship, screens went utterly blank. Outside, the ruins surrounding the sarcophagus began to hum with an ominous vibration, as if an invisible wave had rippled through the entirety of Mors Eternum. Orbital debris veered violently off course. Escort vessels lost all stability. Fighters were torn from their formations, spiraling helplessly into the void. It was as if the very star system recoiled in fury at the trespass. As if something slumbering for eons had finally stirred at the invader's touch. Still, High Command's voice crackled, demanding continuation. More power, more drilling, more brute force, and in that precise instant the final barrier surrendered. The sarcophagus opened, not with an explosive boom, not with a violent wrenching, but with an almost ceremonial slowness, as if the entire universe collectively held its breath for this singular moment. The casing plates parted in utter silence. The pulsing light within vanished, the surrounding field collapsed, and from within that cosmic tomb a single figure emerged. A man, alone, utterly still, standing. At first, comprehension simply failed them. There were no cables linking his form to arcane machinery, no signs of deterioration, not a hint of decay, death, or biological failure. The figure appeared utterly pristine, preserved with an impossible perfection, as if he had been placed there mere seconds before. But it wasn't his presence that was most disquieting. It was the crushing weight of it. Even motionless, this being felt too massive for existence itself, as if space-time subtly buckled around him, as if the very void bowed in recognition. His armor was obsidian, marred by luminous fractures that spiderwebbed across the metal like veins of slumbering energy. Fragments of blades were fused to his back, sealed against his form as if they were natural extensions of his very being. His face, partially veiled by an ancient intricate structure, held the terrifying serenity of one who had not slept, but merely waited. The soldiers tried to raise their weapons, tried to regroup, tried to retreat, but it was already too late. Because in that precise, eternal second, the warrior's eyes opened and the universe itself tilted. There was no battle cry, no pronouncement, no grand declaration, only presence. A presence so crushing that several soldiers simply froze in place, unable to twitch a muscle. Their armor systems failed, their visors warped into garbled static. The chamber's instruments shrieked, then died, their dials spinning into chaos, utterly failing to chart a phenomenon that mocked their very existence. Slowly, deliberately, the figure uncoiled from the sarcophagus, bearing the eons with a casual grace, each measured step reverberating through the ruined sanctum with a chilling quietude that only ratcheted the tension. No rush, no doubt, only an implacable certainty, the cold resolve of one who wakes to find themselves encircled by adversaries. The military opened fire, a reflex, a fatal miscalculation. Before their projectiles could even kiss their targets, the impossible unfolded. Bullets pirouetted mid-air, caught in an unseen current, violently arcing back to carve gruesome paths through the very soldiers who had launched them. In the blink of an eye, the front line dissolved into a grisly ballet of shattered armor and flung bodies, chaos erupting in the hallowed space. While their minds reeled, the warrior understood. There was no need to question his location, nor the identity of these intruders. The desecrated ruins, the shattered emblems, the alien weaponry, the violated seal, it all screamed its truth. Without a single spoken word, the stark reality hit home. They had unmade what they couldn't comprehend, and then, for the first time in an age, his name echoed through the cosmos once more. Rykos. A name buried beneath forgotten epochs, an enforcer, a living relic, a walking judgment held dormant by civilizations who understood his terrifying potential. Humanity's grave misfortune was that they did not yet. Aboard the command vessel, officers howled conflicting orders. Some transmissions whispered of an ancient combatant, others of an aggressive entity. Appeals for containment, for retreat, for immediate annihilation fractured the air, but their directives were moot. Rykos was already stirring. As he lifted his gaze, seeing through the shattered remnants of the structure, the vast human fleet dominating the orbit of Mors Eternum, something primordial awakened alongside him. Not merely memories, but a reckoning. For this was no mere man emerging from a prison. It was an archaic power confronting a new epoch of decay, the past returning to collect its due. It was the dawn of a retribution that would send shivers through the very bones of the galaxy. Humanity had come to Mors Eternum seeking a weapon, but instead they had stumbled upon something far more dreadful. They had found one who knew precisely how to dismantle empires. Such formidable beings are not simply born, they are forged in conflict, sculpted by desolation, and occasionally shackled by the cosmos itself when they grow too dangerous to roam free. For Rykos was more than an ancient warrior, more than a forgotten weapon, and certainly no common survivor of a vanished civilization. Before he became legend, before his entombment in a sarcophagus drifting in the dark embrace of Mors Eternum, Rykos bore a name that made entire empires recoil. He was the executive arm of an order that predated humanity's ascent, a covenant established not to rule the galaxy, but to prevent its devouring by civilizations too ravenous to acknowledge their own limits. For untold ages, as species bloomed, withered, and vanished among the stars, there were those who watched in silent vigilance, not kings, nor gods, nor conquerors, but custodians. Beings chosen to preserve galactic equilibrium when imperial hubris threatened to turn the universe into an eternal charnel house. This order sought no glory, unfurled no banners, engaged in no territorial squabbles. It manifested only when chaos curdled beyond redemption, when an empire began to consume entire systems, when forbidden armaments were unleashed, when civilizations began to believe the universe was theirs by divine right. It was then that the order moved, and when the order moved, Rykos was the inevitable consequence. Among all its members, he was not the wisest, nor the most compassionate, and certainly not the most diplomatic. He was the finality, the hand that fell when all other avenues were exhausted, the blade unsheathed when treaties turned to ash, the name whispered only after the sentence had been passed. Rykos was the order's supreme executor. Where his presence manifested, alliances crumbled. Where his shadow swept, war machines dissolved. He brokered no peace with tyrants, offered no second chances to civilizations that had fueled their expansion with the suffering of others. His mission was simple, relentless, absolute. Eliminate existential threats to the galaxy's balance, and he pursued this mission with such brutal efficiency that in time his very existence blurred into myth among the elder races. Some called him the arbiter of the stars, others the executioner of the void. There were those who swore Rykos was not a living being, but a cosmic will made manifest whenever the universe needed to defend itself from itself. Yet behind the legend there was a man forged in discipline, trained to shed his very self for a greater cause. From an early age, Rykos learned that attachment was a shackle, that hesitation cost entire star systems, that a single ruler spared by misplaced mercy could doom billions in the future. And for a long time, he believed it. The Order was all he knew, all he served, all that justified the blood on his hands, but even the most steadfast minds begin to fray when steeped in an ocean of atrocity. Over the centuries, Rykos witnessed civilizations begging for forgiveness moments before activating world-shattering devices. He watched leaders proclaim themselves saviors while drowning stars in conflict. He observed entire races justifying massacres with grand pronouncements of destiny, survival, and superiority. And with each new campaign, it grew harder to distinguish duty from eternal damnation, because to safeguard balance often demanded horrors mirroring those he was sworn to extinguish. Thus, Rykos began to transform, not a metamorphosis of might or skill, but of insight. He started to question the Order's own boundaries. He began to perceive that, though distinct from the empires they toppled, the custodians had also become entrapped by their own unyielding dogma. They judged entire civilizations, chose who might endure, decided the fates of whole peoples in the name of a balance that often only they themselves claimed to comprehend. And then came the cataclysm that devoured all, not a common war, not merely another campaign against an expansionist empire, but a conflict so vast, so devastating, so utterly uncontrollable that it shook the very foundations of the Order itself. On the galaxy's farthest fringes, a coalition of renegade civilizations had discovered ways to weaponize gravity, dark matter, and stellar collapse. Entire worlds were crushed, systems vanished from maps, fleets were torn asunder by gravitational distortions so violent that not even light could escape intact. The Order intervened. Rykos was dispatched, and for the first time, not even he was enough to quell the menace swiftly. The war spread like a plague. Each victory cost thousands of lives. Each advance revealed new horrors. Forbidden technologies were unleashed unchecked, and the very fabric of reality began to unravel in entire regions of the galaxy. It was in this hellscape that Rykos found the armaments that would define his legend. Umbra Rex, the dark matter blade, capable of eroding any structure, flesh, or energy it touched. Solcrux, the sword of searing photons, born to pierce impenetrable armor and cleave through war bastions. Mycelis, the living symbiotic weapon, capable of merging with its wielder's body and transforming combat into pure adaptation. With these blades in hand, Rykos ceased to be merely the Order's executor. He became its ultimate instrument. They say it was during this war that he perfected vector dominion to a level beyond mortal ken, not just deflecting projectiles or redirecting attacks, but altering the course of entire starships, changing the trajectory of orbital bombardments, and weaponizing his enemy's own momentum against them. In combat, his reflexive, hyperspeed warped perception, making the universe itself seem to crawl around him, as if time bent to his will. But with each surge of power, the burden of his deeds became a crushing weight. At the war's end, the order prevailed. Yet victory brought no peace. It brought silence, desolation, and an impossible truth. The order had not saved the galaxy without a price. It had mutilated the galaxy to keep it alive. Millions perished, civilizations vanished, entire regions became uninhabitable, and Rykos, who had once accepted all in the name of duty, finally discerned what had been before him for ages. Balance, unmoored from empathy, was merely another mask for tyranny. It was at this point that the schism occurred. No complete records exist of Rykos's exact actions. Some whisper that he turned against the Order's own leaders after unearthing secrets that should have remained buried. Others claim he challenged an internal decision that would condemn innocent systems in the name of statistical stability. There are even those who believe the Order, fearing what he had become, chose to remove him before his sense of justice strayed too far from their commands. Perhaps all these versions hold a kernel of truth. The fact remains that at some point, Rykos ceased to be merely the Order's executor and came to be seen as a risk to it, a warrior too powerful, too aware, too unchained. One who understood the galaxy's flaws and the hypocrisy of its self-proclaimed guardians. So they chose the only path left. They sealed Rykos. They did not kill him, for perhaps they could not. They did not destroy him, for they knew his power would shatter any common prison. So they did what desperate civilizations do in the face of the uncontrollable. They entombed him. They created a sarcophagus capable of holding him in suspension. They buried his existence in the ruins of Mors Eternum. They erased his name from the annals, his history fractured into whispers, legends, lost warnings among ancient species, and they let time do the rest. For ages, it worked. Rykos remained dormant. The Order faded. Empires rose and fell, new wars ignited, new lies spread, and eventually humanity, having devoured its cradle world, now turned its ravenous gaze to the stars. Now, waking in a universe dominated by a species that had transformed guilt into justification and conquest into identity, Rykos understood something with immediate, brutal clarity. The galaxy had not transcended its cycle. The menace had merely donned a new guise. Humans were not just another aggressive empire. They were the perfect synthesis of every monstrosity he was forged to confront. They spun lies to uphold power. They used suffering as a pretext for invasion. They corrupted technology, memory, and destiny in the name of their own supremacy. In short, humanity had become precisely the kind of force that had spurred the ancient order into existence. And this time, Rykos would fight as no one's servant. He would heed no counsel, no codes, no leaders hidden behind the word balance. There would be no order to contain him, no voice to temper his judgment. There would only be the searing, crystal-clear vision of what needed to be done. For if he was once the blade of an ancient order, he was now something far more perilous. He was an unbound executioner. And for an empire built on sand, sown with deceit and watered with blood, there is nothing more terrifying than such a being awakening from the past. There are horrors endemic to war: incinerated planets, desolate cities, annihilated fleets orbiting dead suns. But there are atrocities born not of desperation, but of cold, calculated malice. And when Rykos opened his eyes once more to the galaxy, that is precisely what he found. Not just conflict, not just territorial squabbles, not just another empire armed to the teeth. What he found was something worse. An entire civilization that had codified destruction into method, falsehood into bedrock, and cruelty into legacy. Initially, all Rykos possessed were fragments. Corrupted data extracted from the human fleet systems, military logs salvaged from vessels daring to breach Mors Eternum, faint transmission traces, occupation maps, campaign archives, colonization reports, biological containment protocols, lists of species categorized as hostile, useful, or disposable. But mere minutes spent sifting through this digital refuse, and a monstrous truth began to coalesce before him. Humanity had not simply expanded, it had left a trail of corruption in its wake. Entire systems had been invaded under the guise of preemptive security. Planets that had never threatened humanity were seized, bled dry of their essence, and transformed into industrial hubs to fuel the imperial machine. Alien oceans bled into vast industrial reservoirs to supply reactors. Bioluminescent forests vanished in weeks under total extraction operations. Atmospheres were forcibly warped to favor human colonies, even if it meant dooming native species to a protracted, agonizing fade. And this was only the beginning. Rykos delved into the deepest imperial campaign logs and saw the pattern repeat system after system. First came the narrative, potential threat, biological risk, signs of hostility, strategic necessity. Then came the armed emissaries, the honeyed promises of cooperation, the demands for submission. And when any people refused to kneel, humanity descended from the heavens like an ineluctable judgment. There was no true dialogue, no coexistence, no intention of peace. There was only annexation, assimilation, and annihilation. Entire civilizations were fettered with gilded chains. Some were labeled protectorates, others integrated territories. But behind the pristine language of imperial decrees, the reality was always the same: slavery, cultural erasure, and absolute exploitation. Rykos found records of species used as labor in mining belts near unstable stars, amphibious peoples confined to industrial vats for the extraction of rare compounds from their own bodies, telepathic clans fragmented and redistributed among colonies to prevent collective organization, alien progeny funneled into re-education camps where they learned early on that to resist humanity was to resist the universe's progress. This wasn't governance, it was cosmic domestication. And the deeper Rykos delved into these archives, the more unbearable the weight of his discoveries became, because humanity didn't just destroy worlds, they didn't just conquer, they stole memory. Historical archives of entire civilizations were rewritten after conquest. Monuments were dismantled, languages forbidden, religions criminalized. Anything that might remind a people of who they had been before human arrival was treated as an ideological threat. The Empire didn't just want to defeat enemies. It wanted to rewrite their very genesis. It wanted the universe in time to forget the taste of freedom. It was then that Rykos found the technological records, and he understood the rot festered even deeper. The great human fleets, celebrated as the ultimate symbol of the species' supremacy, had not been born solely of human ingenuity. Much of the technology powering the Empire was a testament to plunder, vivisection, and desecration. Grav drives had been pirated from forgotten empires. Warp cores replicated from sacred relics pried from dead worlds. Symbiotic military systems were born from living organisms captured, studied, and weaponized. Dark matter armaments were developed from stolen research of peoples humanity had promptly exterminated. They didn't just conquer, they plundered the very souls of the vanquished. Every ship, every cannon, every imperial cuirass carried fragments of destroyed species so humanity could continue its advance. It was as if the Empire had learned to weaponize genocide as a form of engineering, and that stirred something within Rykos. Not immediate rage, not yet. First, the silence, the kind that screams before a cataclysm, the kind of calm that descends only when something primordial, something ancient, stirred within him, for Rykos had faced tyrants before. He had toppled empires. He had witnessed civilizations justifying atrocities in the name of survival. But there was a singular, chilling depravity about humanity. They had devoured their cradle world, and instead of learning from the ashes, they used it as a blueprint for spreading ruin. They carried not remorse, they carried resentment, And worse, resentment armed with stolen might, slick propaganda, and messianic zeal. In imperial command centers, conquest was called stability. In official pronouncements, slavery became productive integration. In military archives, the extermination of resistant species was described as strategic neutralization. Humanity had a pristine label for every atrocity, and perhaps that was what disgusted Rikos the most. The sheer, unvarnished hypocrisy. Their talent for playing the victim while crushing billions underfoot, their audacious gall to plant flags on graveyards, their pathological need to see themselves as saviors, even as space itself began to rot under their presence. He continued his investigation. What he saw next was even worse. Planets contaminated not by accident, but by cold calculation. Entire ecosystems altered to prevent the return of rebellious native populations, biotechnological diseases unleashed in insurgent zones, moons refitted as orbital oubliettes, where species deemed irreconcilable were held for generations until they faded from history. Even the very art of war had been corrupted. Humans didn't merely seek to win battles, but to leave scars so profound that no people would dare resist again. This was terror elevated to doctrine. In one record, Rikos accessed images of a world called Serin IV, an oceanic civilization that had refused to surrender its crystalline reactors to the Empire. First came the emissaries, then the orbital blockade, then the tidal bombardments, capable of raising entire oceans against their own submerged cities. When the resistance finally fell, the survivors were classified as technical resources and distributed among human naval laboratories. In another archive, he saw the fate of Thalkor, a planet of living deserts and crystalline spires where an ancient species had mastered the manipulation of gravitational resonance. Humans struck agreements, stole knowledge, copied the technology, and weeks later returned with a full fleet, erasing the original research centers and incorporating what remained into imperial arsenals. No crime was accidental, no brutality impulsive. Everything followed a pattern. Humanity had professionalized monstrosity, and then Rikos found something that irrevocably shifted the cosmic scales. Buried deep within a cache of military intelligence and seized data archives, Rikos unearthed highly classified records that chipped away at the very bedrock of the Empire's existence. These weren't public pronouncements, but the hushed confessions of human high command, locked away from all but the highest echelons. They knew Earth hadn't been obliterated by some cosmic foe, but by the hands of its own kind. They knew the alien menace was a meticulously crafted sham, a grand deception. They knew the entire imperial dominion was a monument to deliberate fabrication, yet they chose to uphold it. Not out of a sudden crisis or mere disinformation, but because the lie worked. It forged unity from disparate factions, fueled their relentless expansion, twisted collective trauma into political leverage, and transformed a species' self-inflicted wounds into a moral carte blanche, granting them license to conquer everything in sight, preempting the cosmos from dealing the very blow they'd already delivered to themselves. In that moment, Rikos no longer saw just a brutal empire. He saw an entire species steered by elites who'd weaponized historical revisionism as their most potent tool. These humans weren't merely violent, they were acutely, chillingly aware. They knew precisely what they were doing, and they pressed on regardless. It was then that Rikos's last internal defenses crumbled, for there's a chasm between fighting an enemy lost in their own delusion and confronting a power that recognizes its own rot, understands its degradation, and yet chooses to amplify it. Rikos snapped the data files shut. Around him the chamber still smoldered, a testament to recent carnage. Lifeless soldiers lay scattered amidst twisted metal and pockets of unstable gravity. Outside, the human armada still held mors eternum in its iron grip, as if nothing in the universe could ever truly stand against it. But now everything felt different. Now Rykos held the keys to their undoing. He knew their every atrocity. He understood their machinations. He knew the lies they fed their own kind. He knew how many worlds had fallen while this empire paraded itself as humanity's shield. And above all, he knew the devastating implications of allowing this power to persist. Left unchecked, they would consume new galaxies. They would bury nascent civilizations. They would plunder untold technologies. They would rewrite fresh histories. Until one day, no corner of the cosmos remained untouched by their relentless aggression. For the first time since his awakening, Rykos regarded the vast enemy fleet not as a threat to be assessed, but as a destiny to be authored. No more doubt, no more detached observation, no more room for neutrality. This had to end. Not because he served an ancient order, nor because some unseen hand had sent him, nor for glory, redemption, or balance. It had to end because some plagues, once they reach such a peak of power, can't be reasoned with. They must be eradicated at the root, and in that instant, facing the immensity of humanity's accumulated crimes, Rykos's journey wasn't just an awakening, it had sharpened into vengeance. A cold, clear-eyed, unyielding vengeance, not against a single soldier, nor an admiral, nor a lone fleet, but against an entire empire built on rubble, lies, and countless bodies. Humanity had spent centuries acting as judge and jury of the universe. Now, unknowingly, they had just awakened someone capable of delivering a verdict of their own. Every empire banks on its own might until it meets something that renders it utterly moot. There's a world of difference between being potent and being inexorable. Rykos was the latter. After unraveling the magnitude of human crimes, no sliver of doubt, hesitation, or compassion remained within him. What existed now was something far colder, far more precise, far more terrifying. Purpose. But such a purpose demanded force. Not the kind that overawes armies or wins skirmishes, but the kind that fundamentally rewrites the rules of engagement. For Rykos didn't fight like a common soldier. He didn't move like the warriors of recent eras. He didn't depend on bulky armor, supporting legions, or automated battle systems. He was the very antithesis of military logic. The moment he emerged from his sarcophagus and the first human unit fell before him, a truth began to spread silently through the fleet's systems. This wasn't just an enemy, it was a phenomenon. His movements defied any recognizable pattern. His reflexes were too swift for human readings. His body seemed to obey a distinct physics, as if the usual laws of acceleration, impact, and trajectory were mere suggestions rendered moot in his presence. At the heart of it all lay the ability that would echo through ages like a curse, the vector dominion. To humans, it seemed like sorcery. To the ancients, it was a forgotten art, but in Rykos's hands, it was something far more brutal. He could alter the direction of any moving object. Anything. Projectiles veered mid-flight, snapping back at their own originators. Orbital energy blasts deflected at the last possible second, cutting across enemy lines of fire. Attack drones pirouetted as if an unseen hand had snatched them from their remote operators, guiding them straight to their doom. Even debris, metallic dust, and hull fragments became weapons when they fell under the sway of his will. Rykos didn't just block attacks. He transformed the assault into a self-inflicted wound. This was the true terror of the vector dominion. It wasn't merely defense, it was absolute grinding humiliation, because every human offensive now carried the risk of turning back on itself. The more fire they rained down, the more material they handed him for their own destruction. The greater their offensive, the deadlier his response. It was like fighting someone who read the universe's movements like a personal language, ready to rewrite its grammar in the blink of an eye. But that in itself would be enough to shatter common armies. Rykos, however, was far beyond that. When he advanced, his second ability came into play, reflexive hyperspeed. It wasn't just raw velocity, not even extreme acceleration, it was perception dialed up to the impossible. As combat truly began, the world around Rykos seemed to stretch and slow. Not because the universe actually paused, but because his mind, body, and instincts entered a state of such absolute synchronization that any enemy action became sluggish, predictable, and utterly inadequate. Gunfire crawled. Explosions unfurled like slow-motion flowers. Soldiers barely completed the thought of firing before he was already past them. To outside observers, Rykos simply dissolved and rematerialized. A split second behind the defense line, atop a platform, in the middle of a corridor, standing before an officer who hadn't even grasped that he was next to die. But for Rykos, every movement was clear, deliberate, surgical. This was why he never fought with desperation. He never seemed hurried, never out of control, because, within his perception, the entire battle had already unfolded before it even began. This chilling contrast made everything more terrifying. While humans screamed orders, recalibrated aim, corrected positioning, and struggled to survive the chaos, Rykos moved with the serenity of one who had already seen the battle's end, merely walking towards it. And then there were the swords. Not trivial armaments, not war trophies, not ornamental relics. They were extensions of the very judgment he carried. The first was Umbra Rex, the dark matter blade. Its mere presence felt wrong to human eyes. The blade swallowed ambient light, as if forged from condensed absence. Contours blurred near its edge. Sensors struggled to gauge it accurately, as if parts of its form existed in the gap between the visible and the inconceivable. But the true terror of Umbra Rex wasn't its appearance, it was its touch. Anything its edge met began to unravel. Metal lost integrity, energy fields fluctuated, dense plating became brittle. Even structures reinforced by imperial technology began to yield as if decaying from within. Umbra Rex didn't just cut, it destabilized the localized reality of its target. Against naval armor, it opened gaping black fissures. Against personal armor, it bled away resistance. Against containment shields, it seemed to siphon away the very cohesion of an energy field until it imploded. It was a blade crafted to whisper that even the most solid things in the universe can be reduced to dust. The second was Soul Crux, the photon-laced blade. If Umbra Rex was hungry darkness, Soul Crux was luminous violence. Its edge blazed with a near-stellar intensity, carving lines in the air so swift and precise the human eye could barely track them. There was no excessive weight to its use, no drag. It was a weapon of lethal purity, designed to cleave through resistance with absurd velocity. When Rykos wielded Soul Crux, it was as if space itself had been scored by a shard of the sun. Armored doors were split into perfect lines. Drones exploded mid-air before hitting the ground. Fighters on strafing runs an instant later divided into two incandescent trails, losing pressure in the void. Soul Crux was the blade of absolute incision. No hesitation, no wasted motion, no quarter asked or given. In the wrong hands, it would be a devastating weapon. In Rykos's hands, it was precision, honed into slaughter. And then there was the third, the most unsettling, the least predictable, the one that seemed most alive, Mycelis, the biometallic symbiosis blade. Unlike the other two, Mycelis wasn't merely wielded, it connected. Its structure reacted to Rykos's body as if recognizing him. Living fibers snaked up his arm, over his shoulder, across his torso, forming organic plates, wicked barbs, metallic filaments, and blade extensions that reconfigured themselves with the ebb and flow of combat. At times it resembled a sword. At others, it morphed into a razor whip, an articulated spear, a net of blades or piercing tendrils. Mycelius didn't follow a fixed form because its true power was adaptation. It responded to the environment, to the enemy, to the rhythm of battle. If Rykos needed reach, it grew. If he needed protection, it spawned armor. If he needed to breach multiple defenses, it divided into living extensions that encircled the target from various angles simultaneously. It was like fighting a weapon that learned as it killed. And combined, these three swords made Rykos something nigh impossible to contain. Umbra Rex dissolved resistance. Solcrux delivered the killing blow. Mycelius adapted to every twist and turn. One withered defenses, the other pierced through, the third shattered any predictable counter. But even this didn't fully explain the fear he provoked, because his power wasn't solely in his abilities. It was in how he used them. Rykos never wasted a flicker of movement, never struck in blind rage, never indulged in empty displays of power. Everything about him was precision, everything was calculation, everything was mastery. If a corridor was narrow, he used vector dominion to turn enemy fire into a deadly ricochet trap. If the space was open, he activated reflexive hyperspeed, tearing through the front line before any formation could stabilize. If heavy resistance arose, Umbra Rex shattered it. If instant execution was needed, Solcrux delivered. If the situation changed too fast, Mycelius took over, transforming the battlefield into an extension of his own body. Rykos didn't have a fighting style. He possessed adaptive supremacy. This was what separated a legendary warrior from a living calamity. In Mors Aeternum's central chamber, the first human survivors tried to reorganize their response. Elite units received authorization for portable gravity weaponry. Autonomous drones were unleashed in the corridors. Mobile barriers were erected to stem the advance of this solitary man. None of it worked. Gravitational blasts folded back on themselves, annihilating their own emitters. Drones dissolved before locking on. Barriers were cleaved or pierced by biometallic tendrils that sprang from impossible angles. In a matter of minutes, the containment operation curdled into outright panic. Internal communications began to echo the same question across different frequencies. What is he? But that was never the right question. The right question was, how do you stop something like this? And the truth was, at that stage, no one in the human fleet had an answer. Because the Empire's armies were used to subjugating lesser peoples, flattening disorganized civilizations, crushing resistance through sheer volume of fire and strategic brutality. They weren't prepared to face a warrior who treated war as an absolute language. They weren't prepared for someone who read vectors like maps, perceived time like sound, who carried three weapons forged to unmake empires, who had been trained by an ancient order specifically to dismantle existential threats, and most devastatingly, they weren't prepared to face him alone. This solitary presence was what truly eviscerated human morale. Rykos needed no fleet, no reinforcements, no command, no cover, no rear guard. One man against an entire military apparatus. And yet it was the human fleet that began to look vulnerable. As conflicting reports climbed the war channels, officers refused to accept it. Some claimed initial losses were exaggerated, others demanded visual confirmation. Still others tried to frame Rykos as a biological weapon, an archaic experiment, a controllable anomaly. But each minute of combat rendered these justifications more ludicrous, because the pattern was evident. Everything Rykos touched unraveled. Not by luck, not by chance, not by terrain advantage, but because he was beyond the very scale at which the human empire understood combat. That day, within the ruins of Mors Aeternum, humanity began to taste something it hadn't known for centuries: utter helplessness. The same species that peddled itself as the universe's natural heir, The same species that had enslaved worlds and plundered entire civilizations now trembled before a lone warrior sprung from a cosmic prison. And this was only the beginning. For discovering Rykos's powers was terrifying enough, but far worse would be to see him wield all of it with a singular, chilling purpose, not to escape, not to survive, not to warn, but to punish. Yet there is something even more terrifying than an unbeatable warrior. It is an unbeatable warrior armed with relics that seem forged for the express purpose of unmaking civilizations. For Rykos didn't carry common swords. Each blade in his arsenal was more than a weapon. It was judgment made manifest, a fragment of ancient conflicts, echoes of forgotten ages, lingering just long enough to return and reap a deadly harvest. And perhaps that's what most terrified the humans as they began to review the fragmented records of the Mors Eternum massacre. No matter how many times they replayed the images, no matter how many tactical analysis algorithms tried to translate what they were seeing, no human engineering could account for these blades. Nothing in the Empire's vast armories could touch them, because each seemed to carry not just raw power, but an inherent, deadly intention. As if they had been created to fulfill precise functions in the collapse of empires. The first was the quietest, the coldest, the one that felt wrong to gaze upon for too long. Umbra Rex, the dark matter blade. Even from a distance, it appeared unnatural. Its blade reflected no light, glowed not, trembled not. It simply absorbed everything around it, as if light itself hesitated to touch it. There was something in its form that made the eye stutter for an instant, as if the human brain wasn't wired to fully grasp its contours. But Umbra Rex didn't inspire fear because of its appearance. It inspired fear because of what it left behind. When Rykos raised it, the air around it seemed to thicken with silence. Energy fields fluctuated. Sensors lost accuracy. Solid surfaces would develop microfractures even before the blow landed, as if the mere proximity of the blade sapped the very cohesion from matter. And then came the cut. It wasn't an explosive strike, no brutal impact. It was worse, too clean. Umbra Rex cleaved through metal, flesh, shields, and reinforced alloys, as if revealing that none of it was truly solid. As if all matter, however resistant it seemed, harbored a secret fragility that only this sword knew how to find. Ships struck by. It didn't shatter immediately. First, their structures lost density. The plating darkened. Reactors failed. Containment plates seemed to rot from the inside out. Only then came the collapse. It was as if Umbra Rex didn't just cut the target. It severed its very ability to be in the same way. On battlefields, it functioned as condensed corruption. Everything it touched became less whole, less stable, less alive. For this reason, among the three, it was perhaps the most symbolic. Because Umbra Rex was the blade of inevitable ruin, proof that even the most solid empires can begin to die long before they ever perceive it. The second blade was the absolute opposite. If Umbra Rex seemed like hungry darkness, the other appeared as a star shard-turned instrument of execution, Solcrux, the photon-laced blade. When Rykos drew it, the contrast was almost violent. Where Umbra Rex swallowed light, Solcrux tore across the battlefield in pure, blinding lines of lethal light. Its edge emitted an intense, concentrated luminosity, unstable to the precise degree, as if every inch of its edge thrummed with enough energy to cleave through steel, bone, and orbital armor plating in a single, fluid motion. But the most terrifying thing about Solcrux was its precision. It didn't need the brutality of a heavy weapon. It didn't need to crush to win. Solcrux was lethal refinement. It was the blade made to kill before the enemy even registered the attack. In the logs of the first unit struck down on Mors Eternum, some soldiers simply vanished from the frame. and the next second their bodies or armor would simply cleave apart at impossible angles, as if a line of light had simply decided that thing should no longer be whole. Armored doors opened in perfect cuts. Orbital cannons lost their tips in a dry flash. Drones fell from the air in symmetrical parts. Even reinforced military platforms were pierced in such exact traces that for an instant it seemed nothing had happened until the structure suddenly collapsed. Solcrux wasn't chaos. It was precision elevated to terror. In common hands, it would already be devastating, but with Rykos, it became an extension of his accelerated perception. Since he perceived minute windows, invisible flaws, and movement patterns on an absurd scale, Solcrux didn't need to hit much. It needed to strike true, and it always did. It was the blade of instant judgment, the final line between being alive and already having been cut without realizing it. But among them all, none seemed to disturb the humans as much as the third, because the first two could be described as relics, however terrifying they were. While other blades could be broadly classified as mere armaments, the third, Mycelis, a biomimetic symbiont sword, utterly defied such a simple label. Unlike its counterparts, Umbra Rex and Solcrux, Mycelis never committed to a single form. When dormant, it appeared as a fused mass of organic and metallic components, humming with an eerie living pulse, as if it harbored its own circulatory system. The true nightmare, however, unfurled the instant Rykos's touch awoke it. Mycelis responded, living tendrils snaking up his arm. Plates fused onto his skin, forming an organic carapace that seemed to bloom. Luminescent conduits traced patterns across both metal and flesh, as if recognizing an ancient primal host. Within moments, the weapon ceased to be an external object, melding instead into an extension of Rykos's very being. This profound metamorphosis sent shivers down the spines of even the most hardened military strategists. Mycelis didn't follow blueprints. It learned. It didn't adapt. It evolved. It wasn't merely reconfigured. It became. When Rykos needed reach, its edge extended into segmented shafts. When encircled, it split into razor-sharp tentacles, striking multiple targets simultaneously. Faced with heavy fire, biometallic structures bloomed from his shoulders and torso, forming a living shield. Against armored foes, piercing points emerged from its mass, like fangs forged to penetrate specific resistances. Mycelis wasn't just versatile, it was an apex predator. It seemed to analyze adversaries in real time, comprehending their defensive schematics and selecting the precise configuration to obliterate any opposition. Against infantry, it was pure annihilation. Against machines, surgical infiltration. Against formations, utter disintegration. There was an even more unsettling aspect. In fragmented recordings, Mycelis often seemed to move a beat before Rykos's complete action, hinting at a synchronicity so ancient, so complete, that weapon and wielder were no longer separate entities. This made combat utterly despairing, for confronting Rykos with Mycelis active wasn't facing a swordsman, it was facing a sentient war beast, a cosmic predator that reshaped itself with every moment, transforming the battlefield itself into a living theater of annihilation. And when all three swords were unleashed in sequence, that's when genuine horror took hold. Umbra Rex chewed through defenses, Solcrux ripped open the seams, and Mycelis ensured there was no comeback. One debilitated, another finalized, the third dominated the space between the 2 points. This was no arsenal conceived for honorable duels or empty displays of skill. This was an arsenal designed for unraveling power, for collapsing bastions, for tearing through lines of resistance, for ensuring no empire could place undue faith in walls, shields, or sheer volume of fire. Perhaps that's why these weapons attained the status of legend long before humanity even dreamed of the stars. Ancient peoples didn't just recount tales of Rykos for his battlefield victories. but because wherever he walked, the very fabric of power unraveled, and empires crumbled like sandcastles. His swords were the starkest symbol of this. Umbra Rex whispered that everything can corrupt. Solcrux reminded that everything can be fragmented. Mycelis proclaimed that everything can be overcome by superior adaptation. Together, they transmitted the same message in distinct languages. No empire is eternal, no bastion unbreachable. Within the human fleet, the chilling reality of this spread with alarming speed. Officers tried to categorize the swords by energy signature, exotic composition, tactical risk. Yet, each new report only worsened the situation. There was no pattern, no predictability, no blueprint for effective containment. No predictive algorithm could anticipate Mycelis's next manifestation. No armor plating was proof against Umbra Rex's structural corrosion. And there was no margin for error against a strike from Solcrux. For the first time in a long time, the Empire had no immediate answer, no indisputable superiority, no guaranteed technology, no arrogant certainty that more force would simply suffice. 4. More force merely provided Rykos with more raw material to dismantle, and the more humans examined his weapons, the more they discerned a terrible truth. These swords were not crafted for petty conflicts. They were made for eras when galaxies needed a violent course correction. This meant Rykos had not been trained to eliminate squads, nor to survive localized ambushes, nor to serve as a protector of some ancient order. He had been forged for a far grimmer purpose, to cut through ages of arrogance and put an end to powers that had swelled beyond their rightful place. Humanity, naturally, hadn't yet grasped the full dimension of this. They still imagined they could compensate for the disparity with more troops, more ships, more armaments, more military might. But at Mors Eternum, as reports piled up and fear began to contaminate even the highest echelons of command, a truth was already solidifying in the silence between transmissions. They hadn't just awakened a warrior. They had awakened the wielder of weapons forged to destroy precisely what the human empire had become. And the most chilling part of it all was that Rykos had barely begun to use them in earnest. Empires don't fall in one spectacular crash. They crumble in layers. First, confidence is lost. Then, control. Then, the illusion of invincibility. And only at the very end does the ruin become visible to all. This is how it began. Humanity didn't know it yet, but the instant they awakened Rykos in Mors Eternum, they signed their own death warrant, a descent that no fleet, no propaganda, no stolen tech could ever hope to halt. For Rykos didn't think like a warrior consumed by rage. He wouldn't randomly destroy, he wouldn't waste power on vain carnage, he wouldn't confuse vengeance with impulse. He thought like a meticulously executed sentence. And a perfectly executed sentence doesn't strike where an empire believes it's strongest. It strikes where it believes it's untouchable. The first hours after his awakening plunged the operation at Mors Eternum into utter pandemonium. Entire units lost contact. Containment corridors were transformed into gauntlets of death. Docking platforms exploded as Rykos redirected their own defensive fire against the structure's energy cores. Transport ships vanished, trying to evacuate panicked officers from the central zone. Reconnaissance drones sent back fragmented images of fleeting shadows, blinding flashes, and bodies flung into the void by forces no one could quite comprehend. But this was merely the prelude, because Rykos understood a truth the human empire would be slow to grasp. Annihilating soldiers creates an impact. Annihilating commanders creates disorder. Destroying routes creates strangulation. So he began precisely there. His first significant victims weren't the frontline combatants, but the very brains of the operation. Intelligence officers vanished inside their own tactical rooms. Junior admirals, coordinating formations and retreats, had their command bridges sliced through by impossible surgical strikes before repositioning orders could even be completed. On a warship orbiting the periphery of Mors Eternum, Rykos materialized in the center of the main deck, as if he'd bent space to his will. By the time defense systems reacted, it was too late. The command core was bisected by soul crux, and the vessel began to silently break apart, its entire crew still struggling to understand where the attack had come from. This was the first real sign of collapse. Not the destruction of ships, not the massacre of troops, but the chilling realization that no distance offered safety. Human commanders had built their entire superiority on a chain of control: order, hierarchy, information flow, military centralization. The Empire functioned because it always knew where its strength was, where to move it, and how to crush any nascent resistance before it could expand. Rykos began severing precisely these vital lifelines. Instead of confronting the entire fleet head-on, he transformed each layer of the operation into a disoriented, uncoordinated body. He intercepted transmissions, eliminated those responsible for gravitational navigation, destroyed communication nodes, ruptured supply escorts, and attacked energy depots, hangars, and orbital calculation platforms. With each action, the Empire lost a little more of what sustained its sense of dominion. And the terror of it wasn't just in the losses, it was in the pattern, for officers soon realized this was no mere chance. Rykos wasn't fighting like a rabid beast. He was dismantling the human war machine piece by agonizing piece. First came the forward bases around the outer ruins of Mors Eternum. Watch posts mounted on fragments of ancient structures began to vanish one by one. Some simply lost power and drifted, their entire crews dead before a distress call could be sent. Others exploded from within, as if something had pierced their reactors without triggering a single prior alarm. In several cases, the few survivors repeated the same description in shock. He was everywhere. But Rykos wasn't everywhere. He merely moved too swiftly, thought too many steps ahead, and attacked with too much precision for humans to accept that a single warrior could cause such widespread collapse. Supply routes were next. Smaller cruisers, tasked with transporting ammunition, gravitational cells, and troop reinforcements, began disappearing along the routes between the operation's edge and the campaign's core. In some cases, the wreckage was later found: twisted hulls, compartments opened in perfect lines, propulsion cores ripped out as if by metallic talons, black marks of corroded matter spreading across the internal walls. Umbra Rex, Solcrux, Mycelis. Commanders began to recognize the signatures of Rykos's weapons without ever managing to impede them. When they tried to react by concentrating heavy escorts on logistical routes, he changed strategy. Instead of attacking the cargo ships, he attacked the vessels that calculated safe transit windows between Mors Eternum's gravitational fields. And then something even worse than direct massacre occurred. The very lifelines of the Empire became a noose. Without precise correction, entire cruisers began to miss micro-trajectories too close to the unstable zones. Some were slowly crushed by the gravitational gradient, others collided with orbital debris that should have been avoided by automated calculation. There were cases of vessels being dragged into irreversible spiraling approaches with the black hole, vanishing from sensors amid screams and contradictory orders. Rykos didn't need to destroy the entire fleet with his own hands. He only needed to remove the intelligence that kept it alive. This was the second layer to fall. The third was even more humiliating for the Empire: the erosion of authority. Until then, the official narrative attempted to contain the panic. Internal reports classified Rykos as an isolated hostile asset. Losses were treated as localized incidents. The message to the troops was clear: hold position, reinforcements are coming. The enemy will be neutralized. But the troops began to see something propaganda couldn't erase. Admirals died, flagships retreated, bases vanished, and the isolated asset continued to advance. The legend began there. Among soldiers, technicians, and pilots, Rykos's name circulated not as a tactical designation, but as a curse. Some said he appeared where fear was greatest. Others swore sensors failed because the very space around him rejected readings. There were those who claimed to have seen projectiles stopping in mid-air before returning towards their own launchers, and the most superstitious began to whisper that Mors Eternum didn't hold an ancient weapon. It held an executioner. It was in this climate that Rykos delivered one of the most symbolic blows of his early campaign. On the outer edge of the orbital ruins, humans had erected an improvised military ring, a colossal structure used to coordinate landings, repairs, sensor triangulation, and combat traffic containment. It was a crucial piece of the operation, and therefore surrounded by heavy defenses, escort fighters, and automated batteries. For the Empire, that ring represented security. For Rykos, it was a perfect target. The attack began without warning. First, a failure in the gravitational field of the eastern sector, then loss of power in 2 support blocks. Next, dozens of patrol fighters began losing formation simultaneously, as if some invisible force were pulling their trajectories downwards. Not towards a planet, not towards a station, but directly into the deadly curvature of Mors Eternum. Alarms blared throughout the structure. Pilots tried to correct. Officers demanded vector lock. External cannons opened fire into the void. And then Rykos appeared, amidst the very wreckage of the ring itself, moving between explosions, debris, and metallic fragments suspended by gravitational distortion. He seemed less a man and more a force, shaping the battlefield to his will. Fighters plummeted around him like insects caught in an invisible storm. Some collided as their vectors were altered at the last instant. Others fired and watched their own shots tear through allied formations. Entire sections of the ring broke off and were hurled like gigantic blades against defensive platforms. That battle seared itself into the minds of the survivors because it was the first time many truly understood what it meant to face Rykos in open combat. There was no cover, no real numerical advantage, no guarantee that space itself would obey human calculations. In the heart of the chaos, Rykos advanced from wreckage to wreckage, slicing interceptors with Solcrux, weakening structural supports with Umbra Rex, and allowing Mycelis to expand as a living extension of destruction, ripping through armor and grasping combatants in the void before hurling them against their own hulls. When the ring fell, it wasn't just a structure that was lost. It was an article of faith, the belief that the Empire could stabilize the situation, the belief that mere time, numbers, and brute force would overcome any opposition, the belief that humanity still controlled the campaign. After that, what followed was even more damaging: retraction. Ships began to avoid certain zones. Officers demanded double escorts. Orders to advance were met with seconds of hesitation. Veteran pilots, men trained to bombard entire worlds without flinching, now recalculated every entry into combat as if the very void hungered to consume them at any moment. And in a way, it did, because Rykos transformed any space into hostile territory for the Empire. Corridors, command bridges, repair docks, gravitational routes, orbital ruins. Nothing remained safe for long. This made the High Command finally grasp a terrible truth. They were no longer waging a campaign. They were being hunted, and in a hunt like that, each layer lost weakened the next. Without bases, the fleet lost support. Without routes, it lost flow. Without commanders, it lost cohesion. Without cohesion, it lost morale. Without morale, it lost the very thing that sustains any empire behind its weapons, the belief that it would still win. This is how the first layers began to fall, not with a single collapse, not with an apocalyptic explosion, but with a sequence of precise blows that transformed superiority into disorientation, arrogance into fear, and military occupation into a territory of execution. Humanity had spent centuries imposing this feeling on other peoples. Now it was their turn to feel it. Now it was they who looked at space and no longer saw borders, resources, or dominion. They saw a threat. And somewhere amidst the ruins of Mors Eternum, advancing silently through torn metal, drifting bodies, and signals of panic scattered across the entire military network, Rykos pressed onward without haste. Because he knew. He knew that an empire doesn't need to be destroyed all at once. It only needs to be wounded in the right places, repeatedly, until it begins to fall on its own, and humanity had barely realized that the fall had already begun. Fear isn't a rumor. It's a monster that takes shape before your very eyes. Up to that point, many within the human fleet still tried to cling to some rational hope. They said Rykos was an outlier, an ancient anomaly, an absurdly powerful warrior, yes, but still isolated, still finite, still, deep down, defeatable by the overwhelming sum of human power. That's what the admirals repeated. That's what the military channels broadcast. That's what officers needed to believe for the imperial machine to keep functioning. But Mors Eternum was about to rip that illusion from their grasping hands. Because there was a difference between hearing reports about Rykos and seeing him transform an entire fleet into wreckage before a black hole. After the fall of the first layers of the operation, the High Command realized they could no longer respond with localized containment. The Empire needed to make a demonstration of force. It needed to crush him publicly, brutally, and definitively before panic contaminated the entire campaign. Before the legend became greater than imperial authority could bear, so they gathered everything they had heaviest in the region. Battle cruisers, gravitational destroyers, armored fighter carriers, orbital artillery platforms, rapid interception squadrons, specialized ships for vector manipulation, a wall of metal, fire, and military calculus positioned near the most unstable zone of Mors Eternum. The idea was simple: corner Rykos in a region where even he couldn't move freely. Saturate the space with heavy fire, force him to retreat into the gravitational maw, and if necessary, drag him into the abyss itself. It was an arrogant plan, and thus perfectly human, because there was still something the Empire didn't understand. Rykos didn't fight despite the environment of Mors Eternum. He fought through it. The battlefield slowly took shape like a funeral procession waiting to happen. Ancient debris orbited sluggishly on the periphery of the confrontation zone. Fragments of ancestral structures spun in silence, silhouetted by the distant starlight and the ghostly glow of human engines. Further still, the darkness of Mors Eternum warped the very scenery, distorting perspective, distance, and movement. It was a place where error didn't just cost lives, it warped reality itself. The human ships fell into formation. Lines of destroyers closed the frontal arc. Heavy cruisers anchored their positions using gravitational compensation thrusters. Fighters opened layered pursuit patterns, ready to react to any anomalous vector. Long-range cannons locked onto dozens of simultaneous points, weaving a deadly web around the central region. For a few seconds it seemed the Empire had regained control. It was a colossal sight, organized, brutal, almost beautiful in its monumental hubris. And then Rykos appeared, small against the scale of the fleet, solitary against thousands of weapons. Almost motionless, in the distance, among fragments of metal and suspended ruins. But there was something profoundly wrong with that image, because he didn't look surrounded. He looked like the center. The entire armada converged, a steel fist tightening around him. Commands, sharp and cold as a winter's bite, sliced through the comms, conveying an icy conviction. Orbital batteries spat concentrated energy lances across the void. gravitic missiles, a torrent of silent destruction surged forth. Starfighters dove in a predatory swarm, locking down every conceivable angle. The cosmic canvas exploded into a symphony of light, heat, and terrifying speed. Any lesser being would have been atomized, not Rykos. In the eye of that maelstrom, he moved not as a dodger, nor a defiant warrior, but as a conductor orchestrating a morbid ballet. His vectorial domain unfurled across the battlefield, an unseen decree reshaping reality itself. Energy lances veered off course, like arrows suddenly unbidden by their archers. Missiles, moments from impact, lost their digital minds, spiraling into a cosmic dance of futility. Charging fighters, barely nudged, became unwitting agents of their own destruction, dissolving into a cascade of secondary explosions. Shells, meant to obliterate him, found their marks instead in the very ships that fired them. The chaos began as a whisper, then roared into a tempest. Officers shrieked frantic orders for course correction. Pilots wrestled with unresponsive controls, and automated systems seized, choking on the deluge of impossible data. The fleet's pristine order began to unravel, consumed by its own relentless assault. Rykos, a silent harbinger, advanced through the wreckage. No random strikes, no wasted motion, just the maestro conducting catastrophe. Then he wrought a horror that would forever haunt the waking nightmares of humanity. His gaze, ancient and heavy, turned to Mors Eternum itself, to its vast, hungry curve, to the silent, swirling maw of the black hole, a colossal force that had bent space-time long before humanity ever scratched its first star map. And he decided to use it. At first, a ripple of confusion. Sensors shrieked, reporting impossible trajectories for nearby fragments. Bits of hull, once lifeless, began to stir, converging. What seemed like random space junk became a coherent, terrifying response. In that chilling instant, a vision was born, later to be whispered in trembling tones among the shattered survivors. The tide of steel. Not merely an assault, but a directed cataclysm. Rykos wielded Mors Eternum's gravity as a colossal invisible blade. Fragments and wreckage from the entire conflict zone were dragged, bent, accelerated into a monstrous current of living metal. Dispersed ruins transformed into a deadly wave, spiraling with accelerating fury against the human formation. Cruisers clawed for higher orbital altitudes. Destroyers flared their maximum shields. Fighters broke formation in desperate suicidal flight. All in vain. The tide arrived. First it swallowed the frontline escorts. Fighters vanished, crushed by twisted hull plates and razor-sharp shrapnel moving at insane velocities. Then it tore into the lateral destroyers. Support structures ripped apart, cannons buckled inward, command bridges evaporated under tons of compressed metal. Finally, it struck the cruisers. The impact was so savage that several vessels lost gravitational stability simultaneously. Some collided, others spun wildly, exposing flanks to fresh, accelerated fragments. Entire blocks of ancient ruins speared through Imperial armor like cosmic javelins, entering one side of a ship and erupting from the other in gouts of fire and explosive decompression. But the physical devastation was not the worst of it. It was the absolute, soul-crushing helplessness. The fleet wasn't being overwhelmed by a superior force, nor an enemy superweapon, nor some formless cosmic horror. It was being annihilated by a single warrior who had turned the very debris of battle into a weapon of mass extinction. Survivor accounts were a broken litany of terror. Some spoke of metal flying like ravenous predators. Others swore gravity itself shifted direction with every second. Pilots saw their readouts scream "Ascend," while their bodies were slammed to the deck, feeling like they were plunging into an abyss. Command officers watched, impotent, as entire vessels were dragged into inevitable collision courses with fragments that shouldn't have been moving like that. Everything humanity used to master space was being betrayed by space itself. And in the heart of this collapse, Rykos stood, the calm eye of the storm. Solcrux arced lightning between spinning hulls. Umbra Rex opened structural weaknesses for the tide of steel to exploit. Mycellus spread its living filaments and blades, grasping wreckage, redirecting mass, piercing exposed compartments, amplifying the panic with every new rupture. He wasn't just winning. He was transforming human material superiority into the very instruments of their damnation. At this point, terror ceased to be a tactical concern. It became a psychological plague. Pilots refused approach vectors. Captains begged for unauthorized retreats. Elite units shattered discipline, watching entire cruisers tear themselves apart before their eyes. The fleet's internal channels, once crisp with firm orders and military jargon, filled with trembling voices, pleas for impossible recalibrations, and questions no one in high command could answer. How do you fight someone who turns the very environment into a death sentence? How do you encircle one for whom gravity is a mere tool? How do you maintain morale when every piece of wreckage becomes a weapon in the enemy's grasp? There was no answer. Mors Aeternum had ceased to be a mere backdrop. It had become Rykos's willing accomplice. The battle stretched into minutes that felt like eternities for the humans. With every attempt to reorganize, the tide of steel found a new breach. With every reinforcement launched, Rykos shifted the field, turning a rival into vulnerability. Every second, more metal joined the destructive current, fed by the very wreckage of the ships trying to resist. It was a perfect chain reaction. The more the fleet fought, the more ruins it created. The more ruins it created, the more weapons it offered Rykos. The more weapons it offered, the faster it collapsed. This shattered something fundamental within the Empire. For there, before that impossible tide, fell the greatest fantasy of all, that humanity had truly mastered space. No, they had merely learned to traverse it with violence. To master, it was another thing entirely. In that devastated field, bent by the black hole's presence and the will of an ancient enforcer, it became chillingly clear who truly understood the universe's forces and who merely plundered them. When the worst ceased, the aftermath was a tableau of cataclysm, wreckage everywhere, cruisers torn asunder, bodies adrift. Emergency beacons blinking forlornly in the dark, dead engines spinning aimlessly, and what remained of the human formation scattered as proof of humiliation before the void. It was then that Rykos ceased to be merely a priority enemy. He became something else, a presage, a chilling omen. For the entire fleet understood, even if no one dared admit it aloud, if he could do that with a partial concentration of forces, what would stop him from doing it again and again and again? The tide of steel didn't just destroy ships. It destroyed the conviction that the Empire still possessed inevitable superiority. Now, every human captain who looked upon a debris field saw the same terrifying possibility. Every orbital ruin seemed a dormant weapon. Every unstable gravitational zone, his territory. Every approach to Mors Aeternum, an invitation to oblivion. Rykos hadn't just won a battle. He had taught the human fleet to fear the very stage on which they operated, and for a civilization that had built its power on the belief that any corner of the universe could be conquered. This was utterly devastating. But one pair of eyes watched all this with a distinctly different gaze. Eyes that saw the tide of steel not as a humiliation, but as a confirmation. In the heart of Imperial Command, a woman absorbed the reports of destruction, feeling not just fury, but a strange, potent recognition. For if anyone could look upon that chaos and see not a monster, but a worthy challenge, that person was Celine Voss, and the true confrontation had not yet even begun. Every empire, sooner or later, must put a face to its fear. A moment arrives when soldiers are no longer enough, fleets are no longer enough, cannons, propaganda, strategies, and sheer numbers cease to suffice, and when that moment strikes, power itself must descend from the throne and fight with its own hands. That is precisely what happened after the Tide of Steel. As human wreckage still spun around Mors Eternum like metal cadavers, as distress calls choked the internal channels and officers scrambled to reorganize what remained of the campaign, a different silence began to fall over the Imperial Command Corps, not the silence of shock, the silence of absolute decision. For one person had been watching that destruction with more attention than all the others, one who would not permit herself to tremble, one who saw Rikos not as an impossible aberration, but as the ultimate test of everything she believed in, Empress Celine Voss. Her name alone commanded obedience, even unspoken. For humanity, Celine was presented as living proof that their species had transcended its ancient frailties, not just a leader, not just a commander, a symbol, the woman who promised to guide humanity to the pinnacle of its evolution, not through compassion or diplomacy, but through inevitable supremacy. Where other human leaders spun the myth of terror to mobilize the masses, Celine did something far more dangerous. She believed in the logical consequence of that myth. If the universe was hostile, then it must be dominated. If humanity had suffered, then it must never again be vulnerable. If other civilizations existed, then they must bow before they could ever threaten humanity's future. This was her faith. Cold, mathematical, absolute. Celine Voss wasn't just a product of the Empire. She was its most refined expression. While other commanders hid behind reports, she studied patterns of power. While common admirals thought in terms of fleet, formation, and logistics, Celine thought on grander scales: civilization, destiny, dominion. And it was precisely for this reason that watching Rikos surgically dissect the layers of human power, she grasped what almost no one in high command was prepared to admit. This war would not be won by volume. It would be won by real superiority, and in her mind, only one person could offer that: herself. But Celine Voss was not merely a brilliant strategist. She was not merely the mind behind the Empire's most brutal expansion. She had transformed her very body into a manifesto of power. Long before Mors Eternum, Celine had authorized within herself what many Imperial scientists considered too dangerous even for war prototypes: the implantation of an artificial gravitational core, a mechanical heart fueled by stolen technology, singularity compression, and forbidden engineering, fused to her biological system to make her something beyond human, or at least beyond what humanity had ever been. This core altered everything. Around Celine, gravity wasn't just a natural force, it was an extension of her will. She could increase local density, distort impact, anchor her own body against explosions, crush targets at short range, and create pressure zones so intense that common armor collapsed before direct contact. On the battlefield, she was treated less as a commander and more as a walking gravitational axis, a queen of war forged to prove the human species could rival any power in the cosmos. Perhaps this is why she didn't retreat. Perhaps this is why, before the collapse of cruisers, the humiliation of the fleet, and the rise of Rikos's legend, Celine did what no other leader would dare. She ordered passage opened, not for escape, not for withdrawal, for descent. Inside the central Imperial vessel, as engineers adjusted gravitational compensators and officers still argued for the preservation of supreme leadership, Celine walked in silence down the main launch corridor. Around her, the structure vibrated under Mors Eternum's oscillations. Lights flickered, alarms blared. The Empire, for the first time in a long time, seemed vulnerable even in its own heart. And yet she walked on, without rushing, without hesitating, without betraying any trace of fear. For deep down, Celine saw in that moment the consecration of her worldview. If she defeated Rikos, she wouldn't just be saving the campaign. She would be proving, before the entire fleet, all humanity and the entire galaxy, that even a force from the depths of the past could be overcome by the species' new form. She would be demonstrating that evolution was not a myth. It was a project. It was conquest. It was her. Outside, Mors Eternum continued to curve space in a majestic, cruel darkness. Wreckage still drifted in unstable currents. Remnants of cruisers burned silently. Bodies and metal plates passed slowly through zones where time and perspective seemed to falter. It was a cosmic graveyard. And in the center of this graveyard, Rikos watched. He felt the shift before he even saw it. For some powers don't need to announce themselves to be perceived. They weigh on space, they warp the air, they alter the very sensation of presence around them. When the Imperial capsule emerged from the command ship and advanced towards the edge of the event horizon, even the human survivors understood something different was about to happen. The channels fell silent. Orders ceased. Wounded pilots, terrified technicians, and captains on damaged ships held their breath before their monitors. The Empress was entering the battle. The capsule opened amidst fragments of distorted light. Celine Voss emerged, clad in black and white armor marked by pulsating gravitational lines, as if every part of the suit had been designed to contain a compressed star in human form. The implanted core in her chest glowed with controlled intensity, emitting almost invisible waves that made particles and metallic dust around her changed trajectory in small, irregular orbits. She didn't look like a woman entering a battlefield. She looked like a declaration. Rikos stared at her in silence. And in that single instant, without a word exchanged, both understood something essential about the other. Selene saw in him what the Empire most feared, an ancient, legitimate force, impossible to domesticate, capable of exposing all the fragility hidden behind human grandeur. Rikos saw in her the final form of human corruption, not the masses deceived by propaganda, not the soldiers trained to obey, not the admirals serving out of ambition or fear, but someone who fully knew the Empire's nature and still chose to be its ultimate expression. She wasn't a victim of the lie. She was its high priestess. The space between them seemed smaller than it should have been, or perhaps it was the surrounding gravity already beginning to yield to the tension of that encounter. Selene was the first to speak. Her voice cut across the open frequency channels with an almost offensive calm. There was no hysteria in it, no blind fury, only conviction. She called Rikos a relic, a remnant of a failed era. She said the galaxy always belongs to those with the courage to mold it, not those who try to preserve it in an illusory balance. She said humanity hadn't committed crimes, but inevitable steps of ascent, that worlds fall, species disappear, and only the strong have the right to decide what comes next. For Selene, this was sincerity. For Rikos, it was confirmation. He heard everything without interrupting, without reacting, without offering a counter-discourse, because certain creatures don't need to justify themselves when they finally find the heart of the rot they came to destroy. When Rikos responded, his words came out dry, low, and heavy, like ancient metal being raised from the bottom of a dead ocean. He didn't speak of the old order. He didn't speak of the past. He didn't try to explain what humanity had become. He spoke only of the sentence. He said, "Empires always believe violence makes them inevitable, until they meet someone more inevitable than them." That was enough. The duel began without formal warning. 1 second, they were still. The next, the space between them ceased to exist. Selene advanced first, propelled by a gravitational wave so intense that metallic fragments around her were hurled away. The impact of her approach would have crushed an entire squadron. But Rikos was already moving within his own reflexive hyperspeed. Time, for both, seemed to shatter into layers. Umbra Rex met Selene's expanded gravitational field in a shock that didn't just produce light, it produced distortion. Around the point of impact, space curved like a liquid surface subjected to impossible pressure. Nearby wreckage shifted orbit. Smaller fragments were pulverized. The very edge of the event horizon seemed to pulse in the background, as if Mors Eternum recognized something abnormal was happening there. Selene stepped back in the void and responded with a concentrated gravitational pulse. The wave tore through space like an invisible wall, crushing wreckage in its path and compressing everything into a cone of lethal pressure. Rykos diverted at the last instant, but not just by speed. He twisted the vector of the impact itself, making the wave graze past him and strike a destroyed cruiser behind him, which collapsed on itself as if squeezed by gigantic hands. It was then that the entire fleet understood. This wasn't a battle. It was a clash between two wills capable of bending space to their command. Selene fought with an elegant brutality. Every movement seemed calculated to dominate area, restrict mobility, and impose weight on the environment. She used the gravitational core not just as a weapon, but as a field of authority. Where she passed, pressure changed. The void seemed to densify. Fragments were pulled into her orbit like obedient satellites. Her body moved as if gravity itself crowned her. But Rykos was different. Selene tried to dominate space. Rykos conversed with it. While she crushed, he redirected. While she pressed, he rewrote vectors. While she tried to impose a center, he destroyed the notion of a center. Soulcrux flared in a brutal flash, cutting through a sequence of fragments launched by Selene and advancing in a straight line towards the Empress's chest. At the last instant, she densified the field around her body and deflected the cut enough to save the core. But the blade still tore part of the armor and left an incandescent trace on her shoulder, for the first time exposing that she could bleed. The response was immediate. Selene opened both arms and activated the core to its maximum for a dangerous fraction of a second. A zone of compression was born around her like an inverted sun. A maelstrom of metal shards, dismembered bodies and raw debris was violently drawn into a central vortex, an implosion so devastating it promised to grind all life into oblivion between its crushing layers of steel and overwhelming force. Mycelis responded in a flash. The living blade surged, engulfing Rykos's arm and torso in a grotesque bloom of biological armor. Razor-sharp tendrils shot out, anchoring him against the relentless pull, while Mycelis, with eerie precision, began to dance with fate. It subtly shifted the trajectories of key fragments within the maelstrom, unraveling the implosion's destructive ballet. A path defying all logic opened before him, a tunnel through certain death, and Rykos plunged through it, rocketing straight for Selene. Their collision was nothing short of cataclysmic. A silent, concussive wave ripped outwards, tearing through the very fabric of the void, flinging debris in every direction. Far-off combat craft, monitoring the scene, bucked violently, their sensors screaming in protest as detection arrays overloaded and monitors winked out, plunging pilots into temporary blindness. Just beyond the immediate chaos, a gravitic singularity shimmered, the very precipice of an irreversible void. This was where their duel dragged them, each furious exchange of blows pulling them closer to a domain where distance, light, and time twisted into meaninglessness. Here, there was no margin for error, no second chances. A moment's hesitation meant being consumed, swallowed whole. A misstep by a single millisecond could spell the end of all existence. Memory itself wiped clean in the crushing abyssal depths of Mors Eternum. Perhaps this was why Selene Voss wore a faint, chilling smile. Deep down, she knew this was the ultimate crucible, the perfect stage to validate her core philosophy. If humanity truly sought to master the cosmos, they needed to assert their dominion precisely where the universe roared its defiance. And Selene intended to carve that declaration in blood, breaking Rykos at the very threshold of the inconceivable. Rykos, however, bore no such satisfaction. There was no defiance, no ego, no need to confirm anything in his stoic gaze. With every fleeting second, he grew sharper, quieter, deadlier, stripping away the superfluous layers of combat until only the raw, undeniable truth remained. The precise point where Selene could be unmade. He understood her in a way few could. The gravitic nexus wasn't just the engine of her power, it was her belief made flesh, her ideology given form. To merely defeat Selene in combat would be a victory in a skirmish. To shatter the core meant dismantling the ultimate symbol of human dominion, delivering a final absolute verdict to eternity. The Armada watched, a collective breath held captive in the void. The last remnants of the Empire saw their sovereign empress locked in a duel at the very precipice of an event horizon against a warrior risen from the depths of history, a living embodiment of retribution. Each impact promised to rewrite destinies. Each devastating blow threatened to drag both combatants past the point of no return. With every passing second, it felt as though the entire galaxy had paused, frozen in the brutal tableau of their clash. In a very real sense, it had. Should Selene emerge victorious, humanity would claim the impossible as their birthright, wielding this triumph to legitimize untold epochs of conquest and shadow. But if Rykos were to prevail, the hegemony would lose far more than a mere leader. It would lose the very identity, the bedrock mythos that sustained its colossal ambition. Empires could weather wars and rebellions, but few, if any, could survive the utter unraveling of their own foundational narrative. As they hurtled towards the swirling, curved maw of Mors Eternum, a realm of warped light, disintegrating wreckage, and a dying gravitational field, one truth became starkly, chillingly clear. This wasn't just a contest of raw power. This was a cosmic referendum, a brutal duel to determine which philosophy would endure. Would it be that of a humanity that devours, deceives, and dominates, forever insulated from the sting of vulnerability? Or would it be the grim testament of an ancient arbiter, returned from the abyss, to remind the universe that even its grandest empires are not beyond judgment? At the ultimate brink, where a single misstep meant eternal dissolution, Rykos and Selene Vos launched themselves at one another, two diametrically opposed answers to the same universe-shattering question: who truly holds the right to forge the very stars themselves?